We're just learning that the notorious gangster James Whitey Bulger has been killed in prison.
On October 30th, 2018, notorious mob boss Whitey Bulger was wheeled into his new cell at USP Hazleton. Within 12 hours, inmates beat him to death, crushing his skull with a lock in a sock. His crime? Being a snitch. Here's some of the most brutal gang murders ever recorded in prison.
Authorities in Mexico say about 50 detainees died after a prison riot in the northeast of the country. Angry relatives gathered outside the Topo Chico facility, notorious for its violence.
February 10th, 2016. It'd be a night like any other, inside Topo Chico prison in Monterrey, Mexico. Inmates locked in their cells and guards doing their rounds. But by the time the sun rose, 49 men were dead, beaten, stabbed, and burned in one of the worst prison massacres in Mexico's history. What happened that night wasn't just a riot, it was a war between two factions of the notorious Los Zetas cartel, a gang so brutal they made headlines for dissolving their enemies in barrels of acid. But this time, the battle wasn't fought in the streets. It was fought in an overcrowded prison where guards were outnumbered and gang leaders ruled like kings. That said, it might not surprise you that Topo Chico prison wasn't just a prison. It was its own lawless city. It was built to hold far fewer inmates than the 3,800 crammed inside. And with only 100 guards on duty, the real power belonged to the prisoners. And when I say power, I mean actual power. Some inmates weren't just locked up. They were living in luxury. They had air-conditioned VIP cells, king-sized beds, mini fridges, aquariums, even saunas. Meanwhile, the average prisoner had to pay rent just to have space to sleep. And those who couldn't afford it slept in the hallways. Not only that, but corruption was so bad, entire businesses ran from inside the prison. There were inmate-run food stalls, a bar, and hundreds of altars dedicated to Santa Muerte, a skeletal saint worshipped by cartel members. And what about the guards, you ask? Well, they mostly just made sure the real bosses, Los Zetas, had everything they needed. And that's exactly what made that February night so terrifying. Because when the cartel turned on itself, there was no one to stop them. The tension started around 11:30 p.m. Juan Pedro Saldivar Farias, known as LZ-27, decided he'd had enough of his rival, Jorge Ivan Hernandez Cantu, aka El Credo. Now, both were powerful Zetas leaders, but they decided only one could run Topo Chico. Saldivar's men stormed the prison, attacking anyone who stood in their way. They weaponized whatever they could get their hands on: bats, knives, razor blades, pretty much any kind of shiv. Some would even use chairs, others would swing bottles like hammers. It was nothing short of a fight for survival. Some prisoners tried to hide, others had no choice but to fight. But then someone set fire to the food storage area. The flames spread quickly, swallowing parts of the prison and trapping many inmates in their cells. For 2 hours, the prison was a battlefield. The guards were outnumbered, outgunned, and probably too terrified to even try. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m. that the Mexican army, federal police, and even local forces would storm in and take control. But by then it was too late. The violence was shocking, even by cartel standards. 40 of the dead had been beaten and stabbed, some with knives, others with hammers and metal bars. Another 5 were so badly burnt you couldn't recognize them. Yet, somehow, despite all that, only one person died from a gunshot. A prisoner shot by a guard trying to protect a group of women. That guard, Jose Reyes Hernandez, would later be charged with murder. But the biggest shock came after the bodies were cleared. When authorities finally searched everything, they found what looked less like a jail and more like a gangster's mansion. Corruption wasn't new in this prison, like many in Mexico, but what they found was kinda next level. Guards had basically let inmates build their own economy. And so if you had money and connections, prison life wasn't so bad. If you didn't, well, you were at the mercy of those who did. After the massacre, authorities arrested the prison warden and the superintendent, charging them with failing to maintain order. They also transferred 233 to other prisons, including the 2 cartel bosses responsible for this. But let's be real, the problem wasn't just that prison, it was the whole system. Topo Chico wasn't unique. Mexican prisons have long been overcrowded, corrupt, and dominated by cartels. And this riot, it's just another reminder of that. For many inmates, prison isn't a place to serve time. It's another battlefield. And this next incident just proves it. March 4th, 2009. Inside Sareso State Prison in Ciudad Juarez, guards were going through their morning routines, probably expecting just another tense but manageable day. But by the time the sun was fully up, 20 men were dead, and Mexico had yet another bloody chapter in its cartel war. 14 gang members from the Aztecas had overpowered a guard, stolen his keys, and unlocked 170 cells. Not to free everyone, just the ones they needed for their attack. They were targeting their enemies, los massacres and artistas asesinos, who at that moment were with their families during conjugal visits. What followed wasn't just a riot or even a gang fight, it was a massacre. Around that time, Ciudad Juarez wasn't just dangerous, it was the most violent city in the world. The drug war was raging, with the Juarez cartel and Sinaloa cartel battling for control. And while the big cartel bosses pulled the strings, gangs like the Aztecas, Massacres, and Artistas Asesinos did the dirty work, running drugs, collecting debts, and, when needed, wiping out competition. Inside Sareso, those same gangs ran the prison too, and for them, the guards were just background noise. So when the Aztecas decided it was time to take out their rivals, no one would stop them. They began orchestrating their plan around 7 a.m. The Aztecas stormed the conjugal visit area, where their enemies were completely unprepared. Inmates were with their wives, girlfriends, even kids. It didn't matter though, they came in swinging with knives, iron rods, and homemade guns. Some prisoners were stabbed to death on the spot. Others were thrown from the second-story balcony, their bodies hitting the cold concrete. And then someone would set a fire to a cell block, trapping them inside as the smoke and flames spread. For 2 straight hours, it was absolute chaos. The guards were outnumbered and powerless, and it wasn't until the Mexican army and 200 police officers stormed the prison that it finally ended. They had to send in choppers just to gain control. But by the time it was over, 20 inmates were dead and at least 15 injured. And that should have been the end of it. But in Ciudad Juarez, history has a way of repeating itself. January 1st, 2023, 14 years later, same city, same prison, same chaos. This time the violence wasn't just between prisoners, it came from the outside. An armed gang driving armored vehicles stormed Sareso number 3 again at 7 a.m.
Dozens of dangerous criminals are on the run this morning after an armed attack on a Mexican prison over the weekend.
Now, so what we can tell you here is that 10 guards were actually killed and 7 inmates were killed during this issue.
Their goal was to free Ernesto Alfredo Billon de la Cruz, better known as El Neto, the ruthless leader of Los Massacres. From the outside, the cartel opened fire on the prison guards, creating a distraction while inmates rioted inside. By the time authorities got control, 19 people were dead, 10 guards, 7 inmates, and 2 gunmen. And El Neto was long gone, along with over 20 other inmates. For 2 days, Mexican authorities hunted the escapees. The streets of Juarez turned into a battlefield yet again, shootouts, police chases, bodies dropping. January 5th, they finally found El Neto. He went down in a gunfight. The escape attempt was over. But the real problem wasn't. Because again, this attack exposed what everyone already knew. The prison wasn't run by the government, but by the cartels. After this riot, officials would search the prison, and what they found was ridiculous. These guys had access to drugs, stacks of cash, and an arsenal of weapons. And just like in Topo Chico, they had these luxury VIP cells with flat-screen TVs, refrigerators, and personal kitchens. And the worst part, authorities knew, because this wasn't the first massacre at Sareso. You already know about 2009, but that was just one chapter in a much bigger, bloodier story, 2011. 17 prisoners were murdered in yet another gang-fueled riot. The government promised to crack down back then too. Nothing changed. And well, as long as corruption, overcrowding, and cartel control continue, riots like these are not an anomaly. They're just part of the system.
The death toll from prison riots at one of Ecuador's largest penitentiaries has risen to over 100 people, including a number of beheadings.
September 28th, 2021. It all starts off with an explosion, then gunfire. Inside Litoral Penitentiary, Ecuador's largest and most violent prison. Inmates hunted each other down. Some were shot, some were stabbed, and at least 5 were beheaded. And by the time authorities regained control, 123 inmates were dead. The deadliest prison riot in Ecuador's history. Outside the prison walls, families gathered, desperate for news. Some called their loved ones inside, praying they would answer. Others just stood there, waiting for a name on the list of the dead. And the thing is, the bloodbath didn't come out of nowhere. It was building for months. December 2020, a man named Jorge Luis Zambrano, better known as Rasquina, was assassinated. He was the leader of Los Choneros, the most powerful gang inside Ecuador's prisons. And when he died, his empire fractured. Smaller gangs, once loyal to him, turned on each other. Los Lobos, Los Tiguerones, Los Chone Killers. They all wanted to take control. And believe it or not, the tipping point was a birthday party. 4 days before the riot, gang members threw this lavish celebration for a leader inside the prison. During the party, Los Choneros bragged that they were still in charge. Their rivals didn't take that lightly. So on September 28th, they attacked. The first explosion echoes through the prison around 9:30 a.m. The first thing the guards did was run for cover. Then inmates from Units 8 and 9 break out into Unit 5, storming through with guns, knives, and makeshift explosives. Men were dragged from their cells and executed. Others tried to run but were caught and beheaded on the spot. Security forces were overwhelmed. It took 900 police and military personnel to finally retake control of the prison. And when they did, they found all the holes smashed through the walls. Prisoners had literally broken through concrete to get to their enemies. It was a full-blown war. And again, the saddest part was that it wasn't the last time something like this took place within those walls. November 12th, 2024. History repeats itself. Another gang war erupts inside this penitentiary. This time, the toll was 17 dead and 15 injured. Once again, it was about control. The gangs had connections to the Mexicans and Colombians. They weren't just fighting for dominance, they were fighting for power beyond the walls. And the message was clear. The prison didn't belong to the government. It belonged to them. And who knows when the next one's gonna erupt. Because as long as that power stays in the hands of the gangs, you can go ahead and forget about punishment and rehabilitation. It's a battlefield in here.
Inmates on the roof of the Regional Rehabilitation Center in the northern city of Altamira. 16 prisoners were beheaded, dozens of others died from smoke inhalation when their cells were set on fire.
July 29th, 2019. It was 7 a.m. just as breakfast was being served at Altamira prison in Brazil. And for a brief moment, the prison was calm. Then, within seconds, all hell broke loose. Inmates from Comando Clase A, CCA, stormed a neighboring block where members of their rival gang, Comando Vermelho, or CV, were housed. Now, they weren't there to fight, they were there to kill. But they wouldn't go for makeshift weapons and shivs. They set fire to the entire block, trapping their enemies inside. And so what followed was 5 hours of pure terror. When it was finally over, 62 men were dead. Altamira was never built to handle this kind of violence, or even the number of inmates it had. The prison was designed for 200 people, but at the time of that riot, it was crammed with over 450, and there were only 33 guards on duty. That was basically a pressure cooker waiting to explode. You see, Brazil's prison system is one of the most violent in the world. Gangs aren't surviving back here, they're running the place. Authorities knew that the CCA and CV had been at war for years, but they had no idea it would get this bad, that fast. Or maybe they did, and they just couldn't stop it. Now, the attack was coordinated and brutal. CCA inmates first took 2 guards hostage, not to kill them, but to keep them out of the way. Then they focused on the CV inmates locked in the next block. And with their rivals trapped inside, they set the place on fire. Within minutes, smoke filled the air, spreading fast because of the prison's poor design. Inmates screamed for help, banging on the walls, trying to escape, but there was no way out. The fire also made it impossible for guards and the riot squad to enter the prison in time. Meanwhile, inside the burning block, the few who managed to escape were hunted down and beheaded. When authorities finally regained control 5 hours later, the scene was horrific. 16 inmates had been beheaded, 46 had suffocated from the smoke, and some bodies would be burnt beyond recognition. The violence was so extreme that the gunfire from in the prison was heard all the way at the airport nearby. And just when it seemed like the nightmare was over, officials found 4 more inmates dead, suffocated in a prison bus as they were being transferred. Brazil's not a stranger to this kind of horror, and we'll likely see it again. In the past few years alone, there was an incident in 2017 where over 130 inmates were murdered in gang-related prison riots. Back in 2019, 2 months before Altamira, 55 prisoners were killed in just 2 days in Manaus. And more recently, in 2023, another 9 inmates died in yet another prison clash. Every time, the government promising change, more security, better facilities, tighter control, but nothing ever changes.
Authorities say gang members entered a section of this woman's prison where rival gang members were held. Angry relatives want answers after at least 41 people were killed.
June 20th, 2023. The sun had barely risen over Tamara Women's Prison, just outside Tegucigalpa, Honduras, when the first shots rang out. Inside, the prison was in chaos mode, and by the time it was over, 46 women were dead, some shot, some torn apart with machetes, and many burnt alive inside their cells. It wasn't a riot, it was a massacre, and the worst part? No one did anything to stop it. Tamara wasn't just overcrowded, it was run by the gangs inside it as well. For years, Honduras' 2 most dangerous gangs, MS-13 and 18th Street, had been waging war in the streets. But inside here, these were enemies who had to share a small kind of space to survive, and the prison was built for 400 of them, but would hold 900. Violence was nothing new. Inmates controlled everything, from who got food to who lived or died, and there had been warnings, ones the officials did nothing about. 3 years earlier, 6 women were murdered inside here. Some inmates even begged to be transferred, fearing for their lives. Authorities ignored them. Then came June 20th. The members of 18th Street stormed a block housing MS-13. Some were gunned down immediately, others were killed with machetes and other shivs. The rest of the victims were locked inside their cells and set on fire. Thick black smoke would pour out of the prison, visible for miles. Outside, desperate mothers, sisters, and daughters gathered at the gates, crying, begging for answers. No one told them anything. And inside, the guards were doing nothing, just watching. It was like this for hours. The women inside here were left to die. At first, authorities said 41 were dead, but then more bodies started pulling up from the burnt remains, and the number rose to 46. The government goes ahead and blames the prisoners, taking zero responsibility. President Xiomara Castro called it a monstrous murder and accused corrupt officials of letting it happen. Prison Chief Ulisa Villanueva also declared a state of emergency, saying the attack was a retaliation for crackdowns on gangs. And the military was then ordered to build a high-security prison on a remote island to house the worst offenders. But the thing is, Tamara wasn't an exception. It was part of a pattern. In 2012, 361 inmates were burnt alive in the Comayagua prison fire. In 2019, 40 prisoners were killed in 2 separate riots. And in 2020, 6 women were murdered in Tamara's prison after begging to be transferred for their safety. The same things that happened before the 2023 massacre. But again, nothing changed. And the cost? was 46 more women dead, victims of a system that failed them long before that fire was ever lit.
What happened at Lucasville will always be etched in our minds for murder, kidnapping.
Prison guards became hostages.
The inmates rebelled against what they called unfair rules.
We're not going to take this anymore.
April 11th, 1993. Easter Sunday is supposed to be a day of peace, but inside Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, better known as Lucasville, that day was anything but peaceful. That morning, 450 inmates take over the prison. Within hours, the violence started, and by the time it was over, 11 days later, 1 guard and 9 inmates would be dead. It'd be one of the longest and bloodiest prison riots in U.S. history, and it all started with a standoff between 3 prison gangs that had formed a temporary alliance against the state, a conflict that quickly spiraled into something that no one could control. Before that happened, though, the prison was very overcrowded and understaffed, with inmates packed into tight spaces. The warden had also introduced new restrictions, cracking down on movement inside the prison. And then there was the TB test. Muslim inmates refused to take the prison's mandatory tuberculosis shot because it contained alcohol, something forbidden in their faith. Prison officials didn't care. That was the first spark. But then on Easter morning, things exploded into a full-scale riot. And what made this riot different and a lot more dangerous was that enemies joined forces. 3 rival gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Gangster Disciples, and the Black Muslims, formed an uneasy alliance to take over L Block. And when the violence started, they decided to turn it into a bloodbath. 5 inmates accused of being snitches were the first to die. They were stabbed, beaten, or strangled within hours of the takeover. Then they took hostages, guards who had no idea if they'd make it out alive. Next, the inmates demanded change, listing out 21 demands, including better living conditions and fair treatment. But the state wasn't budging, and with every passing day, the tension inside L Block grew even more out of control. By day 4, it was clear. The prisoners weren't going to surrender, and their next move was to make a chilling threat.
If you don't listen, we kill a guard.
Initially, officials didn't believe them. But on April 15, 1993, the inmates followed up on that threat. Officer Robert Vallandigham was struck to death. He was 40 years old, a Vietnam veteran, and just trying to do his job. His lifeless body was thrown into the recreation yard, a brutal message that the prisoners weren't playing games. And they really weren't. For 11 days, the prison was under inmate control. Then, on April 21st, it was all over. The state finally agreed to the 21 demands, and one by one, the inmates surrendered. The prison took back control. But it was clear, nothing would ever be the same again. After the riot, Ohio wanted justice. They focused on the 5 men known as the Lucasville 5, who were sentenced to death for their roles in this uprising. Keith Lamar, now known as Bamani Shakur, was convicted of ordering killings of other inmates. Sadiq Abdullah Hassan was convicted for allegedly ordering Officer Vallandigham's murder. Jason Robb, an Aryan Brotherhood leader, was convicted of 2 murders. George Skatsis was convicted for 3 killings, including Vallandigham's. And finally, Namir Abdul Mateen was also convicted in the officer's murder. For decades, the 5 inmates have maintained their innocence, saying their trials were rigged and that prosecutors made deals with the actual killers in exchange for testimony. Even the lead prosecutor admitted that some inmates got away with murder, but no one else was ever charged. Today, Lucasville is still standing. Ohio tightened its security, added new policies, and built a statewide emergency response system to handle future uprisings. Yet for the men still sitting on death row and for those who lived through those 11 days of hell, one thing is clear. What happened in Lucasville wasn't just a riot. That was a gang war. The USP Beaumont isn't just another high-security federal prison. This is a war zone located in Texas, about 100 miles from Houston, and it's home to some of the country's most violent criminals. Gang leaders, convicted killers, and some who have spent years enforcing their own brutal laws. For some, being in here would be like a prison sentence, but for others, it's more like a death sentence. Over the years, this place has witnessed numerous gang-related murders. And now let's take a look at 3 of these killings that prove the USP Beaumont isn't just about doing time, it's about staying alive. February 12, 2008. Guards making their rounds found 29-year-old Ronald Joseph dead in his cell. An autopsy showed he was strangled to death, either with a ligature or by someone's bare hands. The investigation pointed to James Sweeney and Harry Lee Napper, members of the Dead Man Incorporated, a prison gang known for handling problems internally. It would take 3 years before they were officially charged. By 2012, Sweeney, who was the mastermind, struck a deal, pleading guilty to racketeering and murder, avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life instead. Napper also received a decades-long sentence. But in the Beaumont, it's not just about wars between rival gangs. Sometimes the gangs kill their own. March 3, 2014. That's exactly what happened when 2 inmates, Ricky Fackrell and Christopher Kramer, stabbed fellow white supremacist gang member Leo Johns to death. The 3 were part of the Soldiers of Aryan Culture, or SAC, a white supremacist prison gang. And in this gang, rules are rules, and Johns had just broken them. He'd gambled and even gotten drunk, 2 crimes, according to SAC. So Fackrell and Kramer decided that meant Johns had to die. The defense later argued they only meant to rough him up. But when the attack started, there was no stopping it. By 2018, both men were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. And well, if the 2008 and 2014 murders were personal, well, the killings that take place in 2022 had to be a declaration of war.
All federal prisons in the U.S. were placed on a nationwide lockdown after 2 inmates were killed at a federal penitentiary in Texas. The inmates were killed during a fight at the prison in Belmont involving members of the violent MS-13 street gang.
January 31st. A group of MS-13 members launch a violent attack inside the prison, targeting Mexican Mafia and Sureños gang members. It was a deadly ambush. 34-year-old Andrew Pineda and 54-year-old Guillermo Royes were stabbed to death. 2 others barely survived, suffering life-threatening wounds. And the attack was so violent that the entire federal prison system was put on lockdown. It wouldn't be inmates just settling personal beefs. It was a gang war being fought behind bars. By April, 7 MS-13 members were charged with racketeering and murder in aid of racketeering. But by then, everyone knew the truth. Prisons don't stop gang wars. And at USP Beaumont, violence isn't just a possibility, it's a guarantee. And the question isn't if another murder will happen, it's when. October 22, 1983. It would be another morning at USP Marion. Or at least that's what the guards thought. Officer Merle Klutz was escorting Thomas Silverstein, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, to the showers, the way he had done countless times before. But today was different. Today, Silverstein had a plan. With a makeshift key smuggled in from another inmate, he quietly slips off his handcuffs. And before anyone could react, he had a shank in hand and murder on the mind. 40 stab wounds. That's how many times Klutz was attacked before he hit the ground. And just hours later, another inmate, Clayton Fountain, killed another officer, Robert Hoffman, using the same exact method. 2 prison guards murdered in broad daylight, and just like that, Silverstein became America's most isolated prisoner. But to understand how that happened, we have to go back. Silverstein wasn't always a killer. Back in 1977, he was just a 19-year-old kid who got caught up in the wrong life. He, his father, and his uncle pulled off a few bank heists and ended up behind bars at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. His sentence was 15 years. He could have done his time, gotten out, and started over. But prison doesn't work like that, and Leavenworth was a place where you either became prey or predator, and Silverstein refused to be prey. That's when the Aryan Brotherhood got to him, and he embarked on a road soaked with blood and murder. 1980. An inmate named Danny Atwell was stabbed to death after refusing to smuggle in heroin for the Aryan Brotherhood. Silverstein was convicted of the murder, even though years later, the conviction was overturned when it was proven that witnesses, including a prison guard, had lied. But by then, it didn't matter because Silverstein had already killed again. This time, it was an inmate from the DC Blacks gang, and that's what put a target on his back. That inmate was close to Raymond Cadillac Smith, the leader of the DC Blacks, and Smith swore revenge. For months, the two were placed dangerously close to each other, even though everyone knew what was coming. And then, it happened. Silverstein and Clayton Fountain attacked first, stabbing Smith 67 times before dragging his body up and down the cell block as a warning. And that's when everybody knew if Silverstein was dangerous before, now he was untouchable. After the Cadillac Smith killing, Silverstein became obsessed with Officer Merle Klutz. He claimed Klutz messed with him constantly, taking away his art, harassing him, pretty much making his life miserable. The Bureau of Prisons later denied all that completely, but to Silverstein, none of that mattered. On that morning in October 1983, he took care of it himself. The second he got free from the cuffs, he went after Klutz, making sure he'd never breathe again. And when the guards dragged him away, Silverstein was grinning. Yeah, but you just can't kill a corrections officer and expect to live a normal prison life. Silverstein kept being transferred from one to the next until he landed at ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in America. And there, they made sure he'd never kill again. He was placed in solitary for good, 23 hours a day in a tiny concrete cell. No human contact, not even with the guards. Lights were always on, no privacy, and nothing to do except draw. He called it the Silverstein Suite. The Bureau of Prisons wasn't apologetic about how they treated him. A BOP official simply said,
"When an inmate kills a guard, he must be punished. We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life a living hell. Otherwise, other inmates will kill guards too."
That was the point. They wanted every inmate in the federal system to know that if you kill a guard, this is what happens. And so for 36 years, Silverstein lived in complete isolation, more than any other prisoner in U.S. history. Then on May 11, 2019, Thomas Silverstein died alone in a hospital bed at 67 years old, a man who had spent more time in solitary confinement than most inmates spend in prison. July 21st, 2024, at 8 p.m., inside the day room at Centinela State Prison, inmates were scattered around, minding their own business, or at least pretending to. Something big was about to go down, something Ezekiel Romo, once one of the most feared gang leaders in Los Angeles, didn't see coming. 3 inmates moved on him. No words, no warnings, just a shiv and violence. And then the stabbing began. Guards yelled for him to stop, but nobody listened when the blood was being spilled. It took 4 rounds of pepper spray before the attack finally ended. By then, Romo's on the floor bleeding out, his body covered in stab wounds, the very fate he'd ordered for others countless times. They tried to save him. They rushed him to the prison's medical unit, but deep down, everyone knew he was a goner. At 9:52 p.m., Ezekiel Romo, better known as Wicked, was pronounced dead. And just like that, a man who had built his empire on violence, power, and fear had the last chapter of his story written the same way he lived it: brutal, bloody, and inescapable. And well, if you were part of the Blythe Street Gang in Panorama City, you would know exactly who Romo was. He wasn't just a member, he was the boss. His word was law, and if he wanted you dead, you were dead. It didn't matter if you were his enemy or one of his own guys. If you fell out of line, Romo had no patience for your weakness. But his reputation didn't start on the streets. It started behind bars. At 18 years old, Romo shot a man dead outside a fast food restaurant. That got him 18 years in prison for manslaughter. Most people might have kept their heads down, done their time, but not Romo. Prison didn't break him, it built him. By the time he was released in 2014, he was a different man, more ruthless, more calculated, and he had one goal: bring his gang, Blythe Street, under the Mexican Mafia. But in their world, power wasn't handed over without a fight. So Romo did what he did best. He started making people disappear, for good. He killed anyone who stood in his way or even disagreed with him. By 2022, law enforcement had had enough. They nailed him on murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. And finally, he receives life without parole. Romo didn't flinch. He'd spent more time inside than outside anyway. But little did he know, his sentence was going to turn into a death sentence soon enough. By July 2024, Romo had only been at Centinela for less than a year. But in a place like that, enemies weren't hard to find. The three men who killed him were Christian Moreno, Johnny Garcia, and Christian Hernandez, all having ties to the LA streets. Garcia and Hernandez were lifers for first-degree murder. Moreno was locked up for assault and escape. Not a lifer, at least not yet anyway. The three knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't stop until the job was done. Prison officials haven't given a reason for why Romo was targeted, but here's the thing. People like him don't get killed for nothing. Could have been revenge from his enemies. Maybe it was someone in the Mexican mafia cleaning house, or maybe he simply ran out of power and protection. Whatever the reason, one thing is for sure. Romo knew how the game worked. And on that July day, the game finally caught up with him.
Criminal turned FBI informant who was captured after 16 years on the run was found dead this morning in a federal prison in West Virginia.
October 30th, 2018, at 8:20 a.m. The body of James Whitey Bulger was slumped over in his wheelchair, beaten so badly he was unrecognizable. His attackers had used a lock wrapped in a sock, an old prison trick, to crush his skull. Then they tried gouging out his eyeballs and cut out his tongue, the ultimate punishment for a snitch. But just a day before, Bulger was transferred from the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City to the U.S. Penitentiary Hazleton in West Virginia. He didn't even last 12 hours in this place. Within 5 minutes, one of the most notorious gangsters in American history was dead. But the real question was, how did he even get here? For decades, Bulger ran South Boston like a king. He was the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, having ties to the Irish mob, and he had his hands in drugs, extortions, and murder. Yet somehow the feds would never touch him. Why, you ask? Well, that's because Bulger was playing both sides. He was a CI feeding feds information on the Italian mafia while they turned a blind eye to his crimes. This little arrangement worked for years, until the FBI finally came for him in 1994, but by then, Bulger was already gone. Thanks to a tip from his FBI handler, he disappeared for 16 years, becoming one of the FBI's most wanted, second to only Osama bin Laden at the time. And by the time they did catch him in 2011, he was 81 years old, hiding in this rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica. Even then, he could never admit to being a rat. Never. But in the underworld, the truth didn't matter. To the men locked up in the federal prisons, he was a snitch, and that meant he had to die. Bulger had spent years in safer prisons, places where informants, offenders, and high-profile inmates weren't mixed with the general population. But in October 2018, for reasons that never quite made sense, he was suddenly moved to USP Hazleton, one of the most violent prisons in the country. His medical status had been lowered, meaning he no longer required extra protection. And the moment he arrived, word spread fast. Whitey Bulger was here. To some inmates, that was just a rumor. But to others, however, it was a long-awaited opportunity. Just a few hours after his transfer, 3 inmates walked into Bulger's cell. Fotios Freddy Gaius, a mafia hitman serving life for taking out a Genovese crime boss. Paul DeCalagero, a Boston mob enforcer known for a girl he thought might give him up. And Sean McKinnon, who was serving an 8-year sentence for firearms theft. What happened next would be fast and brutal. Gaius won a padlock stuffed in a sock like a hammer again and again, crushing Bulger's skull, while DeCalagero and McKinnon kept watch. They then tried to tear his eyes and tongue out, the ultimate prison message for a rat. By the time guards found his body, there was nothing left of Whitey Bulger. But the murder raised a lot of questions, as there were so many things that didn't add up. After all, why was this high-profile informant sent to the general population? Why did the BOP transfer him to one of the deadliest federal prisons? And why did they downgrade his medical status right before that transfer? Bulger's family believed it was no accident. They said he was deliberately sent to his death. Even the guards at Hazleton had been warning that the prison was dangerously understaffed and out of control. In fact, just days before his murder, they told Congress that there were already too many inmate killings at Hazleton, and yet they still sent Whitey Bulger right into the fire. By 2024, all three men were charged in connection to Bulger's death. They all cut plea deals. Freddie Gaius got 25 years for voluntary manslaughter. Paul DeCalagero got 4 years for acting as a lookout. Sean McKinnon pled guilty to lying to the FBI about being there when the murder took place, but got no extra time. He's now out of prison. Now, for many, they believe that justice had already been served the moment Bulger's blood hit the floor. Steve Davis, whose sister was allegedly killed by Bulger, said,
"If I ever met Freddie Gaius, I'd kiss his hand like he was the Godfather."
And well, in the end, maybe you can't really outrun the life you chose.